To understand why Russia attacked Ukraine, the first thing we need to understand is how the game of international relations is played. And in international relations, there are two main perspectives: realism and liberalism. These are known as the theories of international relations. So countries take these perspectives when they make their foreign policy. So let's start with the first perspective, realism. So realism sees the world as a place where there is no world government, and it calls this situation anarchy. That means that the highest level of authority in the world are countries. For example, if you are a person inside a country, you can call 911 and someone will come and help you. However, countries cannot call 911 at the international level and expect someone to come and help them. So countries can only rely on themselves. And this situation creates a scenario where countries cannot 100% trust the intentions of other countries. So the main goal of countries is their own survival, because if they don't survive, then they cannot fulfill any of their other goals. So how do you deal with a system like this? There are two ways. So the first one is that you increase your own power and become the strongest country. This way, other countries will not attack you, since those countries that attack you will not survive. However, if a country's power is stronger than the other countries, that country can be seen as a big security threat by the other countries because of that power imbalance between them. So those weaker countries will try to become stronger in order to protect themselves. And this might lead to a security dilemma, which basically is a competition for power. The second way is that a country can increase its own power to match with the power of other countries. And this is done to maintain a balance of power. So this way, a country is seen less as threatening, since both countries will have similar power capabilities. However, it is still possible that a country might get attacked. There's always that possibility. So if a country instead had chosen the first option to become the strongest country, it is less likely that it would be attacked, but it's more likely that it would be seen as a threat by the other countries. So in both of these cases, the strategy that countries pursue is known as balancing. So balancing is the word that refers to that strategy that countries pursue to affect the balance of power by increasing their own power or by trying to constrain a country that's a potential threat. So in order to balance, a country can use military, economic, or diplomatic options, and it can do this in two ways: internally, by increasing their own power, or externally, by creating alliances with other countries. So if we look at Europe, there is one great power, which is Russia. And the other countries in Europe, they are smaller, and individually, they have less power than Russia. So this puts them at a disadvantage against Russia. So what the European countries do is that they pursue an external balancing policy. And they do this by uniting their military power and creating a military alliance known as NATO. So basically, by forming NATO, those countries are able to maintain a balance of power against Russia. And this creates a bipolar system in the region. So if they hadn't formed NATO, Europe would have only one major power in the region, which is Russia. And Europe would be a unipolar region. So in a situation like this, where there is no NATO, European countries would feel threatened by Russia, and they would have to increase their own power individually to protect themselves and balance Russia. So basically, France would increase their power, Germany would also increase their power, the UK would do the same. And this would lead to a similar situation like the one we had in Europe during the World Wars, when Europe was multipolar, and we already know how that went. So these are the basics of the realist perspective in international relations. And this is the perspective that Russia is taking on the NATO-Ukraine issue. So Russia is seeing the game as a game of balance of power politics, and it's following the rules of realism. So now we will look at the second perspective before I show you how these things are very important and how they're related to each other in the whole conflict. So the second perspective is liberalism, and this one refers to liberalism as a foreign policy. Basically, liberalism at the international level, not at the country level. So liberalism also sees the world as anarchic, and it also tries to find a way to avoid wars, but their focus is different. Liberalism pays little attention to balance of power politics. Instead, it focuses on spreading liberal democracy, international law, promoting economic interconnection, making international institutions and organizations. So this is the idea behind the democratic peace theory, which tries to promote democracy to other countries around the world, with the belief that democracies are less likely to go to war with other democracies due to the nature of their system. So it believes that if every country in the world was a liberal democracy, it will be less likely for countries to get into wars with each other. And it also believes that if the economies of those countries were interconnected, it will be less likely for countries to attack others, since their economies will also be affected. So liberalism is also behind the idea of organizations like the United Nations, the European Union, the creation of international law, norms, values, the protection of human rights around the world, and other concepts. So this perspective of international relations is very common in the United States, Europe, Japan, South Korea, in Western countries. So basically, liberalism focuses on values that are common to liberal democracies and moving them from the country level to the international level, with the belief that this can reduce the likelihood of conflicts. Realism, on the other hand, focuses on power politics and the balance of power in the world. So during the Cold War, the world was bipolar. The US and the Soviet Union were basically playing the game of realism and balance of power politics. They were pursuing balancing policies against each other. And after the Cold War, what we had was a holiday from realism. And this is because the world changed from bipolar to unipolar in favor of the US. And when you have a unipolar world and you're the only main power, guess what? You don't have any other country to play the game of balance of power politics with you. Who are you going to balance? Now you can choose your own game. And the US chose to play the game of liberalism. So the US basically tried to export its own domestic ideals and import them to the international level. And it did this because it believes that wars can be avoided by countries being democratic, having their economies connected, creating international institutions. So there was a push for promoting all of these values around the world. And particularly in Eastern Europe, many of those countries became integrated with the European Union. Many of them also joined NATO. However, from this push to promote liberalism at the international level, Russia was mainly opposed to three things. Number one, NATO expansion. Number two, EU expansion. And number three, color revolutions. But since the world was unipolar and the US was the main power, Russia eventually had to swallow them with an angry face. And the main one that Russia was opposed was NATO expansion, because Russia sees NATO expanding and increasing their power as a threat to the balance of power and as a security threat at Russia's borders. So Russia doesn't see this as liberalism. Russia sees this from the perspective of realism and balance of power politics. So Russia and NATO get stuck into what is known as a security dilemma. And this is when NATO's expansion, even if it's for defensive purposes, is seen as offensive to Russia. So Russia needs to increase its power for defensive purposes. But those actions by Russia are then seen as offensive by NATO and by countries that want to join NATO for protection, like Ukraine. So once again, NATO tries to increase its own power for defensive purposes, which is then seen by Russia as offensive. So Russia tries to increase their own power again. And here's the other point. At this same time, China is growing rapidly and becoming the other great power. And this creates a scenario where Russia has a security threat on the European side coming from NATO. And it could potentially have another security threat from the Asia side from China. So facing this situation, Russia decides to partner with China. And they do this for two reasons. Number one, just like I mentioned, because Russia doesn't want to have two security threats in different parts of their borders. One in the Asia part and one in the European part. And number two, because China provides Russia with an external balancing weight that can bring a more stable balance of power with NATO. However, this creates another situation, which is that now the balance of power in Asia has two great powers, China and Russia, and both of them are partnered with each other. So this means that the regional balance of power in Asia is in favor of the Russia-China partnership. And now the other countries in the Asia region need to form an even stronger balancing coalition in order to maintain the balance of power with China and Russia. So these situations give NATO on the other side an even bigger reason to become stronger and to balance Russia, because Russia's partnership with China also affects the balance of power in Asia. So basically what happened here is that the push under the ideals of liberalism to incorporate countries in Eastern Europe into NATO and the EU was seen as a threat by Russia and Russia's position in the balance of power of Europe. And that itself, together with the rise of China, pushed Russia to make a partnership with China, which in turn affected the balance of power in Asia in favor of China and Russia, which gives NATO an even bigger incentive to balance Russia. So now NATO has to find a way to balance Russia, either by becoming stronger itself or by making Russia weaker. And Ukraine was the perfect opportunity for two reasons. Number one, because adding Ukraine to the NATO alliance will increase NATO's power against Russia. So in this case, NATO gains power by expanding and adding a new member. And number two, if Russia attacks Ukraine, Russia will be sanctioned, which eventually makes NATO gain more relative power against Russia, in this case by making Russia weaker. So Russia is now stuck between a rock and a hard place, because in both ways, NATO gains power. Russia now only has two options, and Russia knows that it's already screwed up, no matter what option it takes. If they take option number one, if they allow Ukraine to join NATO, that will increase NATO's power, which affects the balance of power, and it creates a security threat for Russia by having NATO expand to their border again. And let's not forget that NATO includes the US military, which will be right at the border with Russia. And this brings us to the second option, which is that the only way to stop NATO from expanding and gaining power is by invading Ukraine, because this is an issue that Russia cannot fix by itself. It cannot fix this by just increasing their power internally or by forming partnerships externally. This is because Ukraine is the one that decides if they join NATO or not. Russia cannot decide for Ukraine. Ukraine is an independent country with the right to pursue their own independent foreign policy. And for Ukraine, the only way to protect themselves from Russia is by joining NATO. And the problem with this is that when you share a border with a great power, your foreign policy can have a big impact and become a security threat to that great power. For example, the same thing would happen with Mexico. If Mexico needed to protect itself from the US and it decided to make an alliance with another great power like Russia or China for their own protection, the US would go ballistic. We can just imagine how the US would react to that. We know very well how the US reacted to Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And even 60 years later, Cuba still has these sanctions. 60 years later. So Russia's perspective is that if they fail to address the security problem of Ukraine joining NATO, their adversary will take advantage of that, and it will eventually shift the balance of power in Europe profoundly against Russia. So Russia takes the second option and it decides to attack Ukraine in order to remove the problem directly before it creates an even greater security problem where Russia's survival might really be at stake in the future. And from there on, we already know what happened. The rest of the story is just war and tragedy, and Ukraine basically just got wrecked. So, of course, you can totally disagree with Russia's position, but this is what you see when you look at this conflict through a realist perspective, which is the perspective that Russia is taking. And please don't take this video as if I'm in favor of a particular country or I'm trying to justify Russia's actions. No, not at all. Don't get me wrong. At this moment, what we have is an enemy mentality where anything that resembles understanding of Russia's position or even understanding of China can be interpreted as if you are taking their side in the conflict. And that's a dangerous position to be in, because if you want to outcompete Russia or China, you need to understand what they're thinking, what's driving their actions, what's driving their foreign policy. So I don't agree with the war in Ukraine, and unfortunately the normal people living in Ukraine are the most affected by this, and they're also the ones that have very little to do with this whole geopolitical issue. So what I wanted to do in this video was to put on myself both the glasses of realism and the glasses of liberalism, so that you can see what a person would see when a person wears them. So if you remove the glasses of international relations theories and you look at this conflict straight from the perspective of human morality, you will see a completely different perspective, no doubt about it. It would be like you will be staring right at a solar eclipse without any protection. So when you wear the theory glasses, you can see more clearly how the game of international relations is played. And this is the perspective that countries are using when they make their foreign policy. And we actually had a break from this game of realism for a while since the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, because what we had was a unipolar world. It was the unipolar moment of the US. And that's the reason why many countries try to look at international relations from a liberalist perspective. However, we are moving away from the unipolar world to a multipolar world with three great powers: the US, China, and Russia. And when the world is bipolar or multipolar, the game that countries play is the game of realism and balance of power politics. When the world is unipolar, when there's only one great power, then that power can choose its game. And the US chose liberalism. So when we analyze issues in international relations, especially between great powers, the first perspective you should take now is realism. And hopefully, this perspective will help countries understand what the tipping points of other great powers are, in order to avoid creating a scenario that makes another country react like Russia did. So the liberalist perspective should come secondary, because when you pursue liberalist strategies, especially between great powers, those strategies are likely to be interpreted by them as being cold, realist, balancing strategies, not liberalists. So liberalism is a good system at the country level, no doubt about it. But at the international level, it's likely to get into troubles, especially when it gets into territory that belongs to realism or nationalism. So yeah, that's it for this one. And subscribe so that I get more motivated into making more videos. So as always, thanks for watching.